I'm Judy Rush, and it's my privilege to be the mentor relationship manager here. So I get to work with the wonderful mentor externship team at St. Thomas Law School. And there is a bio sheet, and I think it was probably sent out to you. And so you can get more details on each one of us there. But I will tell you about our speakers. And so as the title of the program indicates, sustaining compassion, addressing compassion fatigue and burnout in legal practice. Obviously, this program is going to be about compassion fatigue, which is a particular type of burnout that legal professionals may experience and many times do experience. It will also address the related risks to our well-being from being practitioners and from being humans, including the trauma that we've personally experienced that doesn't depend on us being anywhere involved in the legal system, and secondary trauma and secondary traumatic stress, which we get through the exposure from the work that we're doing with others who are both traumatized, under stressed, and in a difficult situation. We'll also talk about empathy distress and compassion fatigue, which is right there in our title, as well as burnout, which is related, not burnout in general, but burnout in particular. And you'll know a little bit about all of those when we're done. And then finally, this is a program that qualifies for the mental health credit, which is a new thing in Minnesota, because our CLE board said we need to have everyone have information about mental health and well-being in the profession. And so we're going to also talk about some mandated subjects, which are also very well related to the topics we're talking about today, which are anxiety, depression, and substance use disorders. And so lots of good stuff in this program. And importantly, we have with us today 3 amazing speakers who are here to share their experience and their expertise in these topics. So 1 is to kind of know about the risks, and 2 is to be able to recognize them when they're occurring in you or others, and then what to do about them. And so hopefully you'll come away with all of those 3. So we have with us today Courtney Latcham, who is a 2016 grad. She's an attorney doing family law at Hemmerle and Lammers, which is a firm of alumni, which is pretty awesome. Kiri Osowski is a 2015 law grad who is a senior Olmsted County attorney. And then Sarah McGillis, who's with us, she's not an alum, but we'll adopt her because she was a Hamlin law student. And so she was one of my students at Hamlin. So we can adopt her as a Tommy, but she's the outreach director at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. And all 3 panelists, she and the other 2 panelists have all practiced in areas that have significant risks, both because of the nature of the substantive law that they're practicing, as well as the clients that they serve. So Courtney in family law, in fact, referee 3 just mentioned family law as being a perfect example of what we're looking at here. Kiri, who has done both family law and is now in the criminal law sphere, and then Sarah, who did civil and criminal defense work. And so a lot of good experience here, and we're so glad. They'll bring their experience and their insights into the very real risks that we encounter, how and why we're impacted, and then, as I said, practical strategies to protect our health and well-being so we can serve our clients. And so Sarah also brings some particular expertise as the outreach director with Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. And for those of you who don't know, Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers is Minnesota's official lawyer assistance program, and they serve lawyers, law students, judges, and other legal professionals with anything that causes stress or distress, and they're free and confidential. So with that, I think you've been introduced, and you can read up more on those bios later. So I threw a lot of terms out there, and Sarah's going to help us clean that up a little bit. So we're referring to various mental health challenges here. I'm not going to go through the list again, but we have trauma, secondary trauma, and these other things, empathy distress, just so we understand our exposure to these various well-being concerns. Can you kind of take us through and give us some basics?
Yes, I'd be happy to. And I'm just going to put my PowerPoint up at this point because some of these things are a little bit hard to understand. And you're going to hear a lot of terms today. And the literature treats secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, which the official name is empathy distress fatigue, as coextensive in the literature. They are separate conditions, and we're going to talk about what makes those separate conditions today. Oops, sorry, I have to stay close to the microphone. And speaking of distress, and this is definitely not the first time this has happened. Okay, great. So, you know, what we're going to be
Our
talking,
students know that these don't always work. And our
I would say the vast majority of time, I look at this very skeptically and wonder, are you going to let me down? And today is one of those days. So just talking a little bit about what we're going to be talking about, secondary trauma, empathy distress fatigue, which is the clinical definition for compassion fatigue. And then we're going to be talking about burnout. Anytime that we talk about secondary or vicarious trauma, empathy distress fatigue, we're talking about the basis is trauma. So we always start with, you know, what is trauma? And this is what's up here right now is the clinical definition of trauma. But what I'm going to introduce to you is the idea that the Greek word for wound is trauma. And when we talk about trauma, we're talking about a psychic or a moral wound. When we talk about it in clinical terms, we talk about either an event or a series of events that have a very significant impact on us and for which we have a very difficult time adjusting or figuring out how that's going to work in our lives as a whole. It leaves that scar, that wound. Today, we're going to be talking about direct, secondary, and vicarious trauma. When I talk about secondary and vicarious trauma, because I don't want to like overly confuse this, they are one and the same for purposes of what we're going to be discussing today. So when we talk about secondary and vicarious trauma, and we're going to talk about empathy, distress, fatigue separately. When we're talking just about secondary trauma, what we're talking about is that exposure that is caused by being exposed to someone else's trauma. Now, I was in litigation for 27 years as a practicing attorney, and so most of my trauma exposure occurred by virtue of my interaction with substantive material. So either through the discovery process, reports, interviews, recordings that I had to review as part of doing my job. And sometimes that information contained highly traumatic material. You can be exposed through photographs, you can be exposed through recordings. There's a whole body of research right now that is looking at how jurors and judges are exposed to secondary trauma by virtue of sitting through a trial. And in fact, what we know is that, for example, the jurors who sat in judgment of the Boston Marathon bombers got an extended period of time as jurors so that they could receive services through the court system for the trauma exposure they had by looking at these terrible photographs, by hearing these witnesses testify. The more you interact with the traumatized individual, either personally, if it's your client, then we're going to be talking about empathy, distress, fatigue, or if it's the matter that you're talking about, the more significant the consequences could be. So you can imagine any number of cases, including, I think we're going to talk about family law. So maybe this would be a good opportunity for you to talk about exposure through your own jobs.
Absolutely. You don't need a question from me
Oh,
to
yeah.
be able.
Yeah, so in family law, a lot of people that come to us have been through a lot of trauma. We see written descriptions of abuse, we hear allegations of abuse, we see videos, we see photos, all of that kind of stuff is part and parcel of what we encounter in family law. there is a lot of times where that just kind of comes into you as a practitioner as this is part of the job and you just adopt it as how you're approaching a case. There are some situations that will hit you differently. And that I believe is where secondary trauma comes into the practice of family law. I did have one situation where I had a client come to me. I was not his first lawyer, which is a red flag in family law. And there were allegations of abuse. He said that they were not true. I got the file and I went straight to the videos, which is maybe not what you should do, but it is what I did. And the videos were probably the worst videos I've ever encountered in my practice in family law. And this was only about a year ago. And so I've been doing this for a while now. And there was a lot of them and I kept watching them and the kids were there. And what really kind of hit me differently was the kids weren't crying. They were still playing. It was very normal for them. And for some reason that just really hit me like emotionally and physically. And I was like, wow, this is different. And I recognized it was different. I talked to some colleagues in my office and was like, can I represent this guy? Because my job is to advocate for him in a custody trial. And what I just watched might impact my ability to do that as a lawyer. And also as a person, I'm having this very severe reaction to what I just saw. And can I sleep at night representing this person? And I had some really good conversations with my colleagues about it. I also went straight to my therapist and was like, this thing has happened to me. It's never happened before. Why was this situation different? And she helped me identify, a boundary in my practice of, how to kind of issue spot that in future cases and how to manage it. Luckily, I was able to withdraw for other reasons. So I did not have to have an ethical dilemma about whether or not I could represent this person. But it was an example where I believe I experienced some secondary trauma by witnessing the trauma that went on in this family.
And has it impacted how you select clients and respond to clients where there's claims of abuse?
It has, yeah. So it's an interesting line that you have to kind of cross because you can't find out who's telling the truth. It's not really your job as the lawyer, really. You're advocating for someone's positions. But something it hasn't impacted who I take as a client, but it has impacted how I review a file. I kind of start with maybe something a little softer than going straight to the videos. Maybe read an affidavit, read some letters, maybe talk through more with the client. What is she claiming happened and what's in the file, or he is claiming happened? What's in the file that I should know about to kind of prime myself for what I might see, rather than just jump in and kind of get it, as a slap in the face. I'm also really lucky at the firm I work at. It's really, there's an open dialogue of how do we practice in a healthy way. And so if I run into that kind of case in the future, and I don't believe I can ethically represent someone, I do believe that I could consult with other attorneys in my office and someone else would take that case so that I didn't have to do that.
So Carrie, how about you? What have your experiences been around trauma or secondary trauma?
So as Judy mentioned, I used to practice family law. One of the handouts that's available from this presentation is an article that I wrote about my experiences with family law and how it almost destroyed me. Just as some context for why that is, and caution to any law students in a similar situation. I came to law school here at St. Thomas because I wanted to practice family law. Because my parents separated when I was 4 and my mom agreed that we could do joint legal custody 3 months before my 18th birthday. My entire childhood was my parents' divorce and it was messy, it was awful, and because it was Minnesota and Wright County specifically in the 90s and early 2000s. My sister and I were two girls who needed to live with their mother, regardless of what we said she did, which was a lot. There was a lot of emotional abuse. There was some physical abuse at times. I mentioned in the article, there was one point where I think I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. I got in a fight with my older sister, hit her in the hair with a tube of toothpaste while we were getting ready for school and got toothpaste in her hair. And my mom's response was to grab me by the hair and lift me up to face level with her and scream in my face and ask, "Do you want me to put toothpaste in your hair?" No. So that's what I grew up with. And I thought I was going to use my trauma for good. And I think with some clients I did, but it was to my detriment. I took on a lot of the emotions that clients were bringing in. And it wasn't even necessarily like the emotions that they were feeling with it. It was hearing what their children were going through and just realizing like, I can't do this because I'm fighting not for them, not for my client, not even necessarily for my client's kids, but I'm fighting for 8-year-old me. I'm fighting for 15-year-old me. I'm fighting for 5-year-old me. And I didn't need to save that person anymore. So I left. I left family law. I couldn't handle it. I obviously still get a little emotional about it, but yeah, I was re-traumatizing myself and I didn't have to. And so I left.
Sarah, I would guess if you have some both experiences yourself as well as some expertise on how this relates to the rest of us.
Yeah, I do.
You have your own list. Thanks.
When we talk about secondary trauma, one of the things that we try to do is not be affected by the stories of either our clients or the story of the matter. And we as attorneys, many times, and I especially, I can only talk about my own experience, would 100% deny that I was ever affected by anything, even if somebody directly asked me, even though there were times that it was agonizing. And that's why I love this quote by Dr. Nachel Rayomi Riemann. She is so good when she says that the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss on a regular basis, on a daily basis, and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. It gets in, it touches you. And if you have a prior trauma history, which many people do who go into a particular area of law, they go into that area of law precisely to redo or undo some wrong that they experienced in the system. They can have a much more significant stress response as a result of it. When we talk about what are some of the things what are the signs of secondary traumatic stress? I can talk about this, and I'll talk about it in conjunction with one of the cases that I had. I was doing medical malpractice defense during a pretty good part of my professional career. And during that time, I was defending a case that involved the death of a child who was the same age as my own child. And it absolutely sent me reeling. And I really noticed that I was having strong responses when I was reviewing all of the reports. But the thing that really kind of tipped me over the edge is that because of the nature of the case, all of the depositions were video depositions. And there were many, many video depositions. And so I was sitting through these very difficult depositions in which, the family was talking about the loss of this child. I started thinking about my own child. When we talk about some of these symptoms, what we talk about is like avoidance. That is a perfect example because I didn't want to work on that case because it triggered a very strong emotional response on my part. So one of the things that we do when we're looking at trauma is we look at what are there behaviors? Because we all feel sort of stressed out as lawyers, right? I mean, that's kind of a natural state of affairs. But if we start seeing behaviors that are consistent with this, like I'm shoving that file across my desk, I don't want to work on it. Or like in my case, I was crying in the bathroom during a deposition, that could be a sign that something was very wrong. So again, becoming more combative, defensive, or argumentative. For me, I turned it internally and I became a lot more quiet about that particular case and a number of other cases that really seem to affect me. That's some of the things that we see when we're at work. We also see signs at home, and this really showed up for me. Sleep disturbances, playing the tape of, the case or the trauma over and over in the middle of the night. Anxiety, did you guys feel some anxiety, where you're really shook up by virtue of this case? And then, being very much on edge because your resources are being depleted by virtue of your exposure to this trauma. And maybe you guys could speak about if that was your experience as well.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so using the same example, I did see that, showing up in my life outside of work. And I try to have a very clear boundary of work and home. And, like things like when clients say, like, what would you do if this was your kid? Or what would you do if this was your life? I always say that's not for me to decide, because that's getting close to that line that I've drawn for myself in practicing family law. So with this particular situation, I was having increased anxiety. I was having trouble getting the images out of my head. The one thing I really remember is I was sitting on the couch with my kids, and my daughter was about the same age as one of the kids in the video. And instead of enjoying that moment with my kids on my off time, I was thinking about that video. And so that's part of what I broke down with my therapist, is how do I reinforce this boundary for myself, and how do I, keep this out of my life at home, because it's unhealthy for the trauma I see at work to come into my home life.
Sarah, you have some suggestions as to how to avoid.
Oh, yeah, we can talk about those. I mean, there's a number of different, these are risk factors. I'm just going to talk about those very briefly. There's personal and professional risk factors for having a stronger stress response when you're working in these high trauma cases. And one of the personal risk factors is having a history of trauma. Having a history of your own trauma can make you have a much stronger stress response when you're working on these high trauma materials. When we talk about work, and this is particular to lawyers, do you have work overload? Almost all lawyers have some level of work overload at different times during their career. And it tends to be pretty front loaded towards the beginning of your career and becomes a little bit more moderate as you move along. Do you have a lot of trauma cases? If I'm talking to county attorneys or I'm talking to public defenders, they have a high number of trauma cases. And likewise, in family law, in asylum cases, you're going to be exposed to a lot of trauma. Isolation really refers to when they started looking at secondary trauma in the first instance, one of the things that they looked at were social workers and therapists. So they're looking at them and they're realizing that they were very collaborative and they would talk to each other about their trauma cases. And a lot of times the therapist had a therapist that they would debrief with. That was part of their professional practice. But lawyers work in isolation. We don't tend to talk about like, oh man, I'm working on this really heavy trauma case and I am having nightmares at night, or I'm waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning with an anvil on my chest. We don't talk about that. We tend to like deny it. And then of course we work in the adversarial system. That's gonna make anything worse. You don't really realize how different the adversarial system is until you start looking at jobs as a whole. And you realize like, we are the only people who have somebody who is actively working against us at any given time. If we're in the adversarial system, it's a very unique sort of system, and it's going to amp up, your response. So some of the strategies, and these are just strategies that I talk to people about when I talk about secondary traumatic stress, working on these high trauma cases. And a lot of these are ones that I picked up or learned by virtue of the kinds of cases that I worked on my entire professional career. So one of the things that we heard, already talked about were boundaries and setting very clear boundaries in terms of both personal and professional boundaries in order to limit your overexposure to trauma. And then one of the other things that you can do, you can kind of read through this list. I'm not going to read through it, but controlling your workflow, maybe not looking at the video right away, trying to use fewer senses when you're looking at high trauma cases. So maybe reading a report first before you go to watching a recorded video and you're feeling the emotion of the person that's recording. And a lot of these other things are really related to good professional boundaries as lawyers, hard stops on your work days so that you do have time at the end of the day to spend with your family and be meaningful. And of course, I'm here for this very reason. One of the things that we know about attorneys when we talk about professional development is that unlike other professions where secondary trauma is such a huge part of their work, in the law before previously, we didn't have a lot of education on secondary trauma. When I became a lawyer, I didn't even know there was such a thing. And it was many, many years until that I've been practicing, probably 10 or 15 years that I've been practicing, before I was like, oh, that's why I'm having such a strong response to these cases that I'm working on. The other thing that I would tell you is if you do have a high trauma caseload is try to find a time of day, whatever time of day it is, block out a window where you're working on the trauma material and then don't work on it outside of that window. And that allows you enough time to sort of like do some lighter lifting, and kind of prepare yourself for leaving at the end of the day. But what you don't want to do is work on heavy trauma cases at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and think that night you're going to go home and sleep.
Well, and these tips are also, a lot of these are relate to our next subject, which is talking about, burnout, compassion fatigue, and strategies for that. So why don't you tell us a bit about empathy distress and compassion fatigue and how that's different from burnout?
Okay. As you can tell, I do much better when I'm standing. Sitting is feel like really awkward sitting. So empathy distress fatigue is also based on the information that we get from our clients. So, both of you have talked about like when you meet with your clients and they're telling you their stories, you're going to have a natural human response to that. And if you tend to be even a much more empathetic person, which a lot of people do go into like certain areas of the law, like family law, you're really going to try to meet that person where they are and really ask them a lot of questions and tease out that experience. So what happens with empathy distress fatigue, also known as compassion fatigue, is that the caring gets the best of you. In other words, the way that you're interacting and you're hearing the story, you have the trauma of the underlying story. And in addition to that, you are caring for your clients. And so what we find is an exhaustion that relates to that caring. That is the essence of empathy, compassion, or empathy, distress fatigue, or compassion fatigue. They are the same thing, just two different names. So it's that exhaustion that we've given too much. It's that feeling I'm depleted. I cannot give anymore to this person. Or sometimes you might find yourself as a practicing attorney saying by the end of the week, like, I'm all peopled out. I'm just going to work on paper for a while because, I won't have that emotional response. When you have that sense or those feelings, it's usually by virtue of empathy distress fatigue.
And so how is that different from, it sounded like what you were describing is what we normally hear about as burnout. So what's the difference between sort of run-of-the-mill burnout, which doesn't mean that it's not serious, but sort of the standard definition of burnout and the one that you're talking about here, which is empathy fatigue?
Yeah, typically burnout refers to all of the circumstances in your work environment. So you might have burnout that are completely unrelated to compassion fatigue. You might have burnout because you have a high number of cases. You might get burned out because your phone rings nonstop. You might have burnout because you're in a large electronic filing case and there are 2,000 filings that are coming through your notices and you're not sure which ones you have to look at and which ones you don't. You might have burnout because you have a number of different clients, but it's the cumulative nature of the stressors that we have at work, some of which can include secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. They can be underlying parts of that burnout, but burnout paints with a broader brush and looks at all of the circumstances that cause us stress as lawyers.
So we're focused in on, you know, that we're sort of getting from our clients as we give to them.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's move into getting some examples of that from maybe Kira, if you want to go first.
Yeah.
Empathy fatigue.
Yeah, so at my old job, we had a contract with Olmsted County. We represented parents who hadn't paid child support and were facing jail time for their failure to pay child support. And a lot of the clients that we had were repeat clients, and they were repeat clients because they had substance use issues. My ex-wife is in recovery. She's been sober for about 9 years now, 9.5. And when I would meet with clients who would say, yep, like I have issues with substance use when I was fresh with the firm, it was so easy to, yeah, you're gonna go to treatment, you're gonna get sober, I'm not gonna see you again. And I could never really understand why the county attorneys handling child support didn't believe me when I said they're going to treatment, they're going to teen challenge. And 6 months later, I would see them again, and just I'm gonna get sober. This time I'm gonna get sober. And it got so exhausting rooting for them and believing in them. And it was like, yep, yeah, Jesse, you're gonna go to treatment and you're gonna get sober. And they would for a little bit, and sometimes it was longer than others. But it was hard. It was exhausting. One of the ways that I was able to deal with it was speaking with my ex-wife. She was a drug and alcohol counselor, and so just kind of processing some of those things with her and my frustrations. She'd be like, "Yep, I understand. You know, one of my patients just relapsed." I knew that some of my clients were actually her patients. She didn't know that, but just kind of talking about things, and also then just having my own personal understanding, knowing, you know, at least from a bystander's perspective, how hard it is to be sober and get sober and stay sober. But I did have some clients that did stay sober that would show up and say, yeah, I tried to go bowling last week and it's a trigger. I can't go bowling. My wife and I left and I went to an AA meeting and she went to the Al-Anon meeting next door. And I was like, look at you, like, great. And as far as I've seen, he's never been in court again. And that was 6 years ago. But yeah, it's so hard to keep caring about people in those circumstances. And I will just say that I am now a county attorney. I now see a lot of the same people on the arraignment calendar saying, I've got a job interview tomorrow. I need to get out so that I can go to my job interview, or I'm gonna follow conditions of release this time. And I just keep reminding myself of what I learned here at St. Thomas and just respecting that inherent human dignity of everyone in the courtroom. And yeah, I can argue with the judge about like, hey, the facts of their case warrant certain outcomes. But I don't talk about them in a negative way. So that's just my bit.
Well, and you have an example, before you started doing that, you would have county attorneys on the other side.
Yep.
Who didn't necessarily.
Yes.
Who seemed to
Yes.
me to be examples
Yeah.
of of
Yes.
burnout?
Yeah,
or-
yeah, I had one client who, she had substance use issues, she had an eating disorder. She had gone to treatment for both, at one point had missed a child support hearing, so a warrant had issued and eventually she showed up, and I just remember she looked so good. She had gained, she said 30 pounds, and I mean, I even asked her, like, on the record, like, you know, how did treatment go? She went really well. I had assured her, you know, before the hearing, and it wasn't even about her weight. I was like, you look healthy. Like, I'm so glad to see you like this. And the county attorney asked her at one point, well, why didn't you come to the last hearing? And her response, in the smallest voice I've ever heard, was, I don't like the way you make me feel. It wasn't that she was afraid of going to jail for not paying child support. It was how that person made her feel with how he spoke to her. And I'll just say her case is the one and only time that I have cried in the courtroom. And you guys have already seen how easily I cry, so yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
So Courtney, how about you? What kind of experiences do you have?
Yeah, so in family law, we deal with a lot of like high need people. They're going through a very stressful time in their life. And it's really easy, kind of like what Carrie was sharing, to hear the same like buzzwords over and over and kind of get desensitized to those. A big one is like a narcissist. They're a narcissist. They're gaslighting. That's thrown around all the time. And I think it's really important to check yourself that one of these days, and it has happened, this person will actually be a narcissist. And so I try to take every client, their concerns seriously. We get them in a psyche eval. We find out, is this person actually a narcissist or are they not? It's not my job to make that decision. And I try to take each client's concerns seriously. But I definitely see that feeling inside. I have that initial reaction of, oh yeah, another narcissist, yay. It's everywhere. But you have to check that feeling because that is starting to wear away at your compassion and your caring for what these people are bringing to you. Because people do actually have narcissistic personality disorder and it does make them maybe not the healthiest parent. And so as a practitioner, you have to take that concern in and treat it seriously. And this might be getting too much into strategies, but like how I try to do that is to just kind of listen and take it in and try to save my reactions and then kind of process back in my office and be like, okay, well, what should we do with this? What should I be asking for in discovery? Where do we go from here? And not just outright dismissing a client's concerns because you hear those concerns repetitively in family law because you're dealing with, you know, breakdowns in families and everyone has not great feelings sometimes. Yeah.
Well, that gives us a pretty good idea of what it looks like, what it feels like. And we're going to talk about what to do about it, kind of big picture towards the end. But I think, Sarah, first we're going to take a look at some of these other mental health concerns that sort of both relate to what we're talking about and are necessary in order to get credit under the mental health credit. So, which means, seriously though, which means that this stuff is the basics of the EQ that we need, the IQ that we need on these particular topics.
Yeah, so when I look at mental health concerns, and we're looking at them in the context of secondary trauma, what we're talking about are what are the things that are most likely to occur if in fact you have this repeated trauma exposure and you leave it unattended to. Now, of course, our goal would be that once you've sat through like one of these seminars and you kind of have it on your brain, you might respond quickly if you started seeing behaviors like avoiding clients or not returning calls, because those behaviors would ring a bell in your head and you'd say, hey, there's something going on here that requires my attention. But Unfortunately, one of the things that we find is that by virtue of our practice, a number of different mental health conditions do occur. And one of those is depression. Lawyers suffer depression at a rate that's 3.5 times greater than that of the general population. And part of that might be related to the fact that a lot of us are dealing with individuals who are in the worst emotional times of their life. So they're coming to Courtney and Carrie when their marriages are falling apart or when things have really gone south. So that's constant exposure. So we have a really high rate, and we lead the nation in professions who experience depression. The most recent large-scale study shows that rate to be 28%. There are some smaller scale studies, which since that is from a 2016 gigantic study across the entire country, there have been some smaller scale studies in different states that show about the same thing. Not like anxiety, which has gone through the roof, but with depression, it's remained pretty stable. The thing that I'd really impress upon you is that we have an astonishingly high number of attorneys who have contemplated suicide. 11.5% of attorneys at some point or another have contemplated suicide. Let that sink in for a minute. And also let it open your eyes to kind of what's going on in the practice and your colleagues. You're in a position where you're going to be working side by side with a number of different people over the years, and you can kind of watch and see, like, is somebody really struggling? What does depression look like? These are the most common characteristics. They are by no means the only characteristics. I just talked to someone this morning about her experience of depression, and she is completely recovered, and we're going to be presenting a CLE together. But one of the things that she told me is that, you know, like kind of what depression typically looks like isn't what depression looked like for her. She showered every day. She put makeup on every day. She got dressed, and she put on a front of a person that was not depressed until she just could not do it one more day. And then, you know, things went south. But normally what we look at, if you have a baseline for a person and you see them retreating from that baseline, they're no longer involved in their life. They're no longer doing the things that you know that they love to do or that you love to do with them. They're basically avoiding other people because, again, with depression, that the disease itself tells people to avoid. And with colleagues, you're looking at changes in behavior. Somebody who typically would interact with other staff people who now shuts their door and stays in there alone or really isn't interacting in another way. I put this slide in here because sometimes people say, well, what should I say to someone who I know is depressed? And what I tell people to do is think about it as if you had any of your friends, any of your family members, any of your colleagues had some condition that was really debilitating, a physical condition. What would you do? You maybe bring them a meal, you'd maybe bring them some magazines to read, you check in on them, you text them from time to time. Depression is exactly the same way. Reach out. You never know if you could be the person that helps somebody, that acts as the bridge to get someone to the care that they need. The most important message that I like to give, that I think people need to give people who are depressed, is that depression is treatable. It is absolutely treatable. In 2025, we have an enormous number of treatments that are available, treatment modalities that include medication. Okay. I'm a mover. It's just the way I'm wired.
So everyone hears every word that you say.
Yes, so there are a number of treatment modalities now. So we have talk therapy, we have behavioral therapy. We're going to be offering a CLE on dialectical behavioral therapy, which is an amazing treatment modality for depression. We have medications. We have all kinds of different treatments. And again, remembering that the depressed person, the disease itself is lying to them and telling them that they're unique and they suffer uniquely and it's not going to get better. So the most important thing you can tell them is that it will in fact get better. We talk about anxiety. Anxiety is prevalent in our practice, and part of that is related to our desire to control the uncontrollable, right? We so want to be able to control everything, but we can't. And as a result of that, we can sometimes feel very anxious. This is again, 15,000 lawyers that were surveyed in 2016, the same as that depression study. What we saw there is 19%. Smaller scale studies now show that number is closer to 35 to 40%, much higher. And you can all imagine why, right? I mean, the world is pretty uncertain right now, no matter where you're sitting. If you're in this room and you're aware of what's going on in the world, it's a pretty uncertain place. And so that uncertainty breeds anxiety. The practice of law has changed fundamentally since 2000 and COVID. I mean, I never had an online appearance before or after 2000. So, things are changing, and our response to change sometimes is to feel quite anxious about it. These are exactly what you would expect to be the most common ways that that anxiety looks like, that feeling of dread, preoccupation, worry, overthinking everything. Those are very common signs. The last thing that I want to talk about is alcohol use disorder. We have much higher than the general population of alcohol use disorder among lawyers. And part of that, in my opinion, having read a tremendous amount about it, if you go back to that original definition of trauma as a wound, what do we learn to do when we're children and we have something that hurts us? We avoid it, right? We turn away from it. And one of the ways that people turn away from that thing that hurts us, from that stress, is by using alcohol. So what do we see here? We see that among the attorney population, that, the general population, we have this 6%. Here we are with attorneys, 21% have what is considered to be troubled drinking patterns, hazardous, possibly dependence. And if you're under 30 years old, or you've been practicing for less than 10 years, that number climbs to 32%. I can say that I saw, just sort of in my own, I never developed an alcohol use disorder, but those first few years practicing, it seemed like a really reasonable way to turn away from the stress of learning to practice and turning towards something that helped me numb those tough feelings. I quickly learned that was not going to be a long-term strategy for success, and I adopted some other things, which I'm sure that we'll be talking about in these last few minutes. But I'm putting it on your radar screen because it is something that uniquely affects attorneys. So we don't have to do anything more with this.
Great. Thank you. That's so helpful and so important. We all know that. So now let's talk a little bit, awareness of the research of the risks that we have. We have good awareness at this point. We have some good ideas of what it looks like, so we can see the risk in others and in ourselves. But let's talk about the tools that we have, the strategies that we can adopt that actually help us manage this compassion fatigue and empathy distress. So, do you want to go first, Courtney?
Sure. Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Well, I think anyone who's practicing family law, and everyone has obviously their own journey and their own special combination of things to help them manage things like boundaries and self-care. But I think if you're going to practice family law or be exposed to family law, you should be in therapy. It's a great resource. We have some confidentiality things as lawyers that we have to think about. It's nice to have a place where you can just vent or get feedback on this is how I'm responding to what I'm experiencing. And sometimes you don't really need them and you can cancel your appointment, but they're there. So I definitely think having therapy in place is very important as someone who practices family law. I'm really big on boundaries, and balance. So things like I try not to think about work when I'm with my kids. I try not to compare my family to the families I see at work, because I think those are very slippery slopes to blurring those lines. Also, within your workday, you can create space for yourself and for your own peace. So like, in family law, our mediations are like half a day, sometimes a full day. A lot of them are now via Zoom, and sometimes it's just you and your client in a breakout room together. And if you have a very high needs client, they spend that time just continuing to throw venting at you. And at a certain point, as their lawyer, you're not actually doing your job as their lawyer, listening into that conversation or information they're giving you, and it's not helpful. So I always try to build in a break of saying, oh, I have to go to the bathroom. Turn your camera and audio off. We're gonna take a 5-minute break. And then sometimes I don't actually have to go to the bathroom. Sometimes I go for a little walk. Sometimes I fill up my water bottle. Sometimes I get a coffee. And that small break that I built in for myself is going to make me a better lawyer for this client at hour 3 than if I had not done that. Because it's part of balancing out your day and giving yourself space so that you don't burn out in short, really, hands-on, attorney-client moments. Other things are, if you have really high needs clients, you can recognize that and you can set their expectations and limit your exposure to them as well. Not because you don't care about them or care about their case or want to advocate for them, but because you can be a kind, compassionate advocate and also protect your peace and realize where your boundaries are. A very simple one is making sure your phone call is an hour. When you schedule the phone call, you say, hey, just so you know, I have something at 2 o'clock. Our phone call is only going to be an hour today. Even if you don't have something at 2 o'clock, I mean, I'm not advocating for, untruthfulness up here, but
There's something at 2.
Yeah.
yes, there's
Yeah.
something at 2 and it is your self-care time. And then you're not stuck on the phone with this person for hours on end and you don't hang up the phone completely drained, unable to attend to your other clients. But you've done what that client needed. You've heard them out. You figured out how to work that into their case, where their case is. So I think that is really important too, is boundaries with clients, recognizing in yourself when you're feeling that brain fog and you're starting to just like be done for the day. Sometimes I look at my list and I say, wow, I have a lot to do. And then I say, well, how much of this has to get done today? Sometimes I really do have to push through and that stuff just needs to get done that day. And sometimes it doesn't. Just yesterday, I'm coming off of a really, really busy month. And I looked at my list and I was like, oh, I could probably tackle that tonight after the kids go to bed. And then I thought, do I have to? And I left my computer at work and I didn't do it last night. And that's why I'm so refreshed today. So I do think it's just more, everyone has to build their own formula. And it's not, oh, I got my formula, I'm done. It's a constant checking in with yourself. How am I doing? Am I well? Am I practicing in the way I want to practice? Because you'll see it show up in your practice. Things like the narcissist example. You'll stop caring. And that should be a red flag for you as a person and a lawyer that, hey, it's time for a check-in. It's time for me to kind of go into my toolbox. Do I need to talk to my therapist? Do I just need to leave my laptop at work today? Do I need to take a day off? What do you need? And all of those things help avoid compassion fatigue and ultimately burnout.
Great. Thank
They're
you.
good.
How about you, Carrie?
Yeah.
Your
So,
best tip.
well, one is another article that I wrote. It's another handout available today. So as I mentioned, my ex-wife is sober. She was on probation the first 3 years or so that I was practicing, and also had an ignition interlock in her car, which meant I really just could not drink because we couldn't have alcohol at home and I couldn't drink if she drove us anywhere. And I'm a lightweight, so I couldn't drink if I drove us anywhere. So I was almost entirely sober my first 3 years of practice. I really had to build resiliency practices and methods of dealing with stress that did not include drinking. For me, it was baking, running, other sorts of things. Not saying you should necessarily be with someone who makes sure you can't drink, but just you don't have to drink to deal with stress. And I mean, have dealt with a lot of really stressful things in the last 6 months, and I think I have a drink once a week, if that. So yeah, I would just say do your best not to drink to deal with things. Do your best not to drink at all. I mean, there's a lot of evidence about how unhealthy it is. And then just a couple tips from my new practice where I'm a lot happier, and I've had multiple people tell me that.
So the first one is sometimes you need to leave your practice.
Yeah,
right?
sometimes you need to leave. But having friends that you can talk to about what you're doing. So at my old job, basically everyone there was old enough to be my parent. Got great advice from all of them, but at the same time, like I didn't have anyone who understood like my pop culture references or my jokes about like what was going on. And I have that now. And it's so great to work with people that are my age, that get me as a person, but that I can talk to about the details of cases. And the other thing I did at my new job is I have flat out told management, I am not doing person crimes. I'm not doing domestic assaults. I'm not doing sex crimes. I'm not doing any of those because I hated family law so much. I can't do it. And they've honored that request for me, and happier than I've ever been.
Yeah.
All right, Sarah, you got some tips. They might involve Minnesota's Lawyer Assistance Program.
Oh, let me tell you about Minnesota's Lawyers Assistance Program,
2
Lawyers
minutes.
Concerned for Lawyers. That's where I now work. I'm happy to talk to you about the services we provide. As Judy said at the beginning, we provide services to law students, lawyers, and judges, and their immediate family members as well, and legal staff. So sometimes we have people come in and they're like, you know, I have a son or a daughter, or my husband, or whoever it is that needs some assistance. Everything is 100% completely confidential. It includes some counseling services if you decide you want to partner up with somebody for a while and, you know, kind of take that walk and say, like, whatever I'm doing right now has not been effective. So let me get another brain on it. And, you know, maybe they'll have some new ideas for you. There's coaching that's available as well. All you have to do is call. There are a couple of Chase and John are some wonderful case managers to work with. John is the leader of our organization, and I are there to help you with anything that you need. So don't hesitate to call.
MNLCL.
Thank you.
All right. All right, well, they did not leave much time for questions, but I'm sure everyone is willing to stick around afterwards to answer any questions that you have. Thank you so much for attending.
Yeah, thank you.